Following time-honored principle, I invariably, all my conventions, bring twice as many handouts as there are actual audience members. So take two and read it starting. I can't resist starting with a story that was popped up last night on New York Times for those of you who read mainstream media. And it looked like this when I printed it out in the Times print mode. It ran an ad for Piaget watches right through the title and printed very small print. But this morning, this must be time control, here's what the same function came out looking like. In 7 states, atheists have formed a group called Openly Secular to get the clauses out of state constitutions that ban atheists from holding public office. As you may know, one of the 7 states, of course, is Texas. The others are Maryland, up north, Arkansas, Mississippi, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Tennessee. So, and there are 30 groups apparently that are combined to create that effort. Now, there's a presumably apocryphal story about a 3-hour final exam in philosophy with just one question: why? A+ answers were because and why not. The more you wrote, the lower the grade. Following that example, I could answer the question implicit in my title by saying because and sit down. The risk of disappointing some of you, I'm not going to do that. Anyone who heard this before, 2 weeks ago, like Stephen back, perfectly free to leave. There's some changes, there's a new print, there's differences in the handout, but it's not that different. The bad jokes are all the same. You can laugh at some of them if they register. Topic 1, how many gods? Lots of lectures begin with the speaker raising a question and over the next 40-45 minutes answering it. By contrast, I'm going to start with a question that no one can answer unless there really is an omniscient being in the universe. How many gods are there? Or more precisely, how many gods have there been? That is, in the whole 200,000-year history of our species. Since we have no unambiguous information about the religious beliefs of Homo sapiens until the advent of writing just a few thousand years ago, and then only in a very few places, we have no way of telling when and where humans first began to postulate divine entities as explanations for things that otherwise seem incomprehensible. Claims made almost half a century ago, based on grave offerings that the Neanderthals had an afterlife concept, haven't fared well in the professional literature since then. And I'm not aware of any cave paintings or sculptures that have been convincingly interpreted as depicting gods. Put that way, I think you'll agree that the question cannot be answered. But if we could somehow get an exact number, it would be huge. Humans around the world have believed in gods of every shape and size, from seeing some kind of divine essence in ordinary things like trees and streams, all the way up to the celestial and cosmological scale. A popular misconception in the West claims that Hinduism has 330 million gods. Wikipedia calls that number a mistranslation or misunderstanding, although it acknowledges that the true number would be very large. In my field of classics, an eminent Roman historian named Keith Hopkins produced a few years ago this book, letter A on your references list, A World Full of Gods, the title. And he was thinking only of the ancient Greco-Roman Mediterranean basin, where, as his subtitle has it, which you can't read from out there, how Christianity achieved a strange triumph over the polytheisms of the Roman Empire. On a larger scale, a huge 2-volume work, which I couldn't bring in because it's referenced at the UT Library, called the World Christian Encyclopedia, published by the Oxford University Press in 01, that's letter B, states that there are some 10,000 different religions worldwide, and most of them, I would say, are probably not monotheistic. The book also says that there are, at that time, 33,090 different Christian denominations, which means by extrapolation there must be about 40,000 today. But even if precision escapes us, it's worthwhile to spend a few seconds thinking about just how many gods must have been believed in across the millennia. The Egyptians alone had hundreds of divinities and believed in them for about 3,000 years, about as long as the Hebrew God called Yahweh has been around. The Romans had a divinity for everything and were ridiculed by the early Christians for it. Back in 1959, the eminent Roman historian Frank Adcock made a very witty and probably valid observation, references letter C. Quote, had the primitive Romans ridden bicycles, they would, I imagine, have had a domestic goddess named Punctura, who would have had the power to cause or prevent what her name refers to. Exactly one of the best remarks I've heard about Roman religion. So an exact number isn't attainable, but for simplicity's sake, let's say that there have been 1 million gods excogitated over a 200,000 year span by the endlessly fertile imaginations of mankind. In the spirit of comedians who say, I got 1 million of them. I'll come back to that purely hypothetical number. Topic 2, definitions. What is a god? Singular, lowercase g. For definitions in English, we academic types turn to the Oxford English Dictionary, which is like this, or the compact editions like that, which says, quoting, topics 2a on your page, a superhuman person regarded as having power over nature and human fortunes. Now that's refreshingly brief and generic, but now instead of a single thing to deal with, we have 3, the separate words superhuman person and the phrase superhuman person. Turning one problem into 3 doesn't seem like a step in the right direction. Superhuman, of course, must be, in some sense or other, above our ordinary human species. In the classic 70s movie Sudden Impact, Clint Eastwood's Dirty Harry character more than once uses the iconic line, quote please, a man's got to know his limitations. When it comes to being human, most of us do. We have plenty of comic book and fantasy heroes to show us what would qualify as superhuman abilities, but we know that no human actually has them. Some of you will recall Disney's delightful animated classic, The Little Mermaid, and its line, Ursula the Sea Witch has great powers. That typifies the religious mentality. Magical powers do exist, and some superhuman beings do have them. The second word, person, is a lot harder, and recent attempts to pass personhood amendments declaring that a microscopic fertilized egg is a person haven't made things easier. So it's back to the OED. Not so simple this time. The first relevant definition, topics 2b, is from 2.2a, an individual human being, a man, woman, or child, with no hint about whether a child might be prenatal. Farther down, we find 3.4a, the living body of a human being, either A, the actual body as distinct from clothing, or from the mind or soul, or B, the body with its clothing and adornment. And there's meaning 3.5a, the actual self or being of a man or woman, individual personality. The dictionary makers apparently didn't ask themselves whether children have an actual self. Although if you've ever been around someone in the terrible twos, you won't have any doubts. I put the little word "a" in bold to underline the singular aspect. A person is one thing. Are you confused yet? There's also a theological dimension, 5.7a, applied to the 3 distinctions or modes of the divine being in the Godhead, which together constitute the Trinity. 2 of the OED texts quoted for this meaning speak of the mystery that a single Godhead, whatever that is, can contain 3 separate persons. By contrast, 2 of the previous definitions on your page with that singular word "a" also say individual. So the contradiction between 1 and 3 so-called persons is right up on the surface. That, of course, is what makes the Trinity a deep mystery. Let's leave Trinitarianism aside. The deeper difficulty for the theists is that by defining a God as a person, they have committed themselves, generally speaking, to a form of anthropomorphism, portraying a divine being as human. I know there are cases of animal gods. The fancy word for that is theriomorphic. But even those gods are usually imagined as, for example, using human language and having human-like needs. There are 2 problems with this step. First, Religious mythologies sometimes say that the gods created humans in their own image. But of course, at least for those of us who are skeptics, which might be a lot of people in this room, there is the inevitable temptation to reverse the polarity and say that as a form of ultimate self-complement, we humans created the gods in our own image. This helps explain why so many gods behave badly. It's hereditary. 2. A larger problem is that an anthropomorphic conception binds the theists who invented these gods not only to our species, but to our planet, since drawing on centuries of astronomical ignorance, they naturally imagine that the Earth is the center of the universe. We'll come back to astronomy and the universe in a few minutes. So much for the separate words, superhuman and person. Now, what do we make of the phrase superhuman person? I'm not going to deal with whether there are subhuman persons, except to note that people who have pets or work with, for example, primates, elephants, and more than a few other species, do indeed think of them as individuals and in some very real sense, persons. And some people have argued that it's more immoral to murder an animal than to kill his defective baby, Peter St. Christian, for example. At one level, the phrase is no more difficult than the adjective superhuman by itself. World religions, like comic books and movies, are full of superhuman persons. But looked at another way, it gets more complicated. Those aforementioned anthropomorphic gods are undoubtedly superhuman persons. To take an example from my own field, the ancient Greeks would have had no trouble saying that Zeus, or Poseidon, or Athena, or Apollo was a superhuman person. We have lots of vase paintings and statues to show what they look like. The same is true for most of the world's gods. They do qualify as superhuman persons, they just don't qualify as existing. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. Topic number 3, problems of theism and polytheism. Let's return to that arbitrary million gods ideal. How would we establish that any god out of that hypothetical 1 million is real? For physical things or forces, we look to what's called evidence. Objectively verifiable and repeatable phenomena that can have no other interpretation. But no God has ever obliged us by providing evidence like that. Most cultures, of course, have no doubts about the reality of their own divinities, but the evidence they cite wouldn't qualify on any strict definition. And as Richard Dawkins has been pointing out for some time, the monotheists actually agree with us, since they too unhesitantly reject the gods of all cultures except their own. That means that they dismiss, out of my arbitrary million, precisely 99.999%. That is 999,999 of the world's divinities, they say, are frauds, and only theirs, the one, is real. Well, what are the odds on that? More pertinently, what basis do they have for rejecting the 999,999? After all, the evidence, such as it is for other divinities, is no worse than the evidence for their one God. As we all know, science has been industriously removing what used to be claimed by religion as evidence for gods by showing that there are natural causes for lightning and earthquakes and rainbows and just about everything else that we can examine and test. Divine participation in the physical world has been reduced, at least in the eyes of many scientists, to 0. About 250 years ago, the Scottish philosopher David Hume argued that explaining events regarded as miracles by invoking divine intervention was far less plausible than simple misunderstanding of the processes actually going on. Philosophers and theologians continue to dispute whether miracles or any other example of divine agency is possible, but from our perspective, it's just an error of judgment. You may have seen a cartoon showing a classroom whiteboard, I'm sorry I don't have one, I would give this up, covered with symbols and equations, and in the middle, inside square brackets, the words, "Then a miracle occurs." The caption has one lab coat-wearing scientist saying to the other, "I think I see a problem in one of your steps." That's a very compact way of saying that science and religion are not compatible. The problem here is that theists simply leap from whatever facts are brought forward by science to the logically unrelated claim that those facts must have been caused by their divinity. But that's an obvious non sequitur. There's just no connection between physical facts about the real world and beings found only in the stories and folklore of mankind. The inventor of, and I wish I'd brought a decal, the flying spaghetti monster, with its noodly appendages, one Bobby Henderson, a Kansas physics graduate student back in '05, had the right idea to parody the category mistake of attributing real-world events to mythological characters. It would, after all, take a brave soul to deny that the monster is a superhuman person. Conventional pictures of the FSM don't look like a human person, but only the very naive would insist that God really looks like a human person, a bearded male in Sistine Chapel imagery, and yet theologians do tell us very emphatically that God is a person. There's a surprisingly long Wikipedia article on the spaghetti monster, if you want to look it up, dealing with the evolution of the new religion called Pastafarian, or Pastafarian, perhaps. But all the satire shouldn't obscure the challenge it represents. On what evidence can claim that some other God does exist and the monster doesn't? So one difficulty with God ideas is that we have a serious surplus of gods, my hypothetical million, and an equally serious shortage of evidence for any one of them, along with a rapidly shrinking range of things for them to do. I just mentioned the monotheist rejection of 99.999% of all gods. There's another problem with the world's polytheisms. Lots of those religions have died out, and presumably their gods died too. The relentlessly sardonic H.L. Mencken, letter D on your references, published in 1922 a brief essay beginning with the memorable question, where is the graveyard of dead gods? He lists in the article about 185 divinities that used to be believed in very literally and fervently, and are now ignored because their cultures have vanished. The mortality of those gods should be encouraging for us secularists because it creates an admirable precedent for the Abrahamic divinity. If they can die, it can too. Things are not much better for the multiple gods that still exist, that is, still exist in the minds of their native cultures. There are just too many, and in effect they cancel each other out. Topic 4, problems of God. It would be nice if I could use the preceding arguments to brush aside the whole apparatus of divine beings, dismissing all those other 999,999, and as one small part of the package, God with a capital G. I could stop right here and give you a little extra free time for the rest of the afternoon. But that would be mere evasion of the issue, because for the majority of Americans, and lots of other folks as well, there's just one God that commands attention, the capital G biblical figure. So the rest of the talk will address that singular entity, and we'll try to show why it deserves to be enclosed in the parentheses of my title as being no more real than the other gods of world religions. As you can see from the handout, there are 7 subsets under topic 4. 4A, name. I'll begin with a relatively trivial issue. It's really odd that God, in ordinary English usage, is just the generic word for divine being, but capitalized and treated as the official personal name. If I knew more about religions around the planet, I'd be able to say whether this is, as one tends to think, a rare, if not unparalleled practice. It's like having a dog named Dog with a capital G. D. Freud made me say that. Of course, it's not a practice limited to English. In Greek, there was ho theos and he theia, the words for God male and God female, cousin forms to Latin deus and dea. In both languages, the essential root is identical, theta epsilon in Greek, de in Latin, with 2 suffix markers, one for each gender, masculine and feminine. It's a little strange, and I do not have any explanation for this, that the equality implicit in those simple alternative male-female suffixals have been replaced in several modern languages by a special add-on suffix for the feminine side. Spanish has Dios and Diosa. French has Dieu and déesse. German has Gott versus Götten. English, of course, has God and Goddess. All seemingly hinted that the masculine form has priority and the feminine is an afterthought. In any case, if I were the God of the universe, I'd want a real individualized personal name. I wouldn't want the generic. One other thing about the English name God obscures the plain fact that God is really Jewish, and its primary authentic names are Yahweh and Elohim. There is no such being as the Christian God, only the Jewish God who was kidnapped by Christians centuries ago and has now become a victim of the famous Stockholm Syndrome, speaking nowadays with the voice of its kidnappers. Or B, gender. That minor linguistic issue points to a larger conceptual problem, the long-embedded idea that God is male, and is appropriately described with words like he, him, and his, maybe with capital H. This outrageously paternalistic claim, which should be deeply offensive to half the sky, to borrow New York Times writer Nick Kristof's phrase, is the ultimate example of anthropomorphism, and all by itself is almost enough to justify rejecting God. For the remainder of this talk, I'm going to challenge that absurdity by referring to the God thing, capital G and capital T, hyphenated in my print, which actually works quite well as a translation of the Greek neuter expression to thegon, the divine thing, and by using as corresponding pronominal forms it and its with capital I in my print. As secularists, we should do everything we can to undermine this familiar but extremely damaging habit of thought, which reinforces every time it occurs the brazen and mindless Judeo-Christian Islamic sexism. I have to admit I haven't had many opportunities to invite believers to explain the he, him, his forms of reference, so I really don't know how they think that such a primitive idea can be viable in the modern world. It seems likely that the more they would say, the worse it would sound. Some of you will know that there have been theories about matriarchy in various places thousands of years ago, that is, societies where the God thing was a woman, which after all has a common sense basis. The most important thing about life is keeping it going, and only females, at least in humans, can actually bring living babies into the world. But it would still be anthropomorphism, just from the other side of the gender fence. If monotheists want to be taken with any degree of seriousness, the first thing they have to give up is that God is the male claim. For C, numbers. Another thing they should have to give up is the notion that it's somehow better and more logical to believe in just one God. Theirs, of course. The monotheists seem to have the attitude found in the tagline of the seemingly endless series called Highlander, there can be only one. Remember the movie. I've already talked about the hypothetical million gods and the low odds that the only true God is yours, but I want to give one more example of that kind of self-absorbed foolishness, along with a request for help from this audience. I'd be willing to swear in a court of law on a stack of, I think, Darwin's, that I've seen a cartoon showing a World War II victory parade beginning in the rear in the upper left-hand corner and proceeding across the frame like this, ranks and files of soldiers, and in the left corner here, two mothers, one saying to the other, "Oh look, my Johnny's the only one in step." I thought this was by Bill Walden, the great World War II cartoonist, but a search of his books produced nothing. Even more puzzlingly, Google at the phrase, "Johnny's the only one in step," looked at last night, brought up 14 hits, not one of them referring to a World War II cartoon. So if anyone out there can provide a confirmed source, or even say that you've seen the cartoon, I'd be really happy. If Google can't find it, maybe it's one of those urban legends that everybody knows, but aren't true. The Google hits prove that I didn't invent the line, but maybe I'm inventing the cartoon. It wouldn't be the first time my brain has edited reality and made me believe things that aren't true. Some of you remember the line of Mark Twain, that his memory was getting better as he got older, because not only could he remember things that had occurred, he could remember things that hadn't. That's a cautionary warning, by the way, for all the Christian apologists who make the argument that solid eyewitness reports must underlie and validate the gospel stories. As we've known since Elizabeth Loftus's 1979 book, Eyewitness Testimony, it may be the most powerful evidence in court, but it's alarmingly unreliable in reality. I've just given you an example. Or D, omnipotence. I now want to say some things about the more familiar and traditional attributes of God. Omnipotence, omniscience, omnibenevolence, and last but not least, existence. Omnibenevolence, by the way, is a real word. It's M-B-O-E-D. And about a decade ago, I found this charming bumper sticker in Dragon's Lair, the game store that used to be on Burnett Road. I went to the Anderson Lane location a few years ago and asked for this. It wasn't there. They said they couldn't get it anymore. But Google came into existence to answer these needs, and I got this from a supply place in Houston. It's very cheap. But it encapsulates part of the problem of divine attributes. 5 words. I can't do better than this. This is really great. At any rate, look at the page. This is ground that's been pretty heavily plowed over for centuries by philosophers and theologians better trained in these areas than I am, and also in more recent years by people in physics and cosmology, so I may not be saying much that's really original here, starting right now, with 2 familiar puzzles that many of you encountered probably at a pretty early age. There's a slightly childish but still non-trivial paradox. If the God thing is omnipotent, can it create a stone so big it can't lift it? That resembles another wise guy question. Why can't the God thing make a square triangle or a triangular circle? The usual answer is that if things are logically impossible or self-contradictory, then even God can't make them happen. But that does take a certain bite out of omnipotence. You might be surprised to hear that there has been serious philosophical discussion about that stone question, summarized in what is still the best and most comprehensive treatment of the anti-God arguments, this massive, thick book from 25 years ago by Michael Martin. The stone paradox turns up on page 302, at the beginning of an extended section on omnipotence, which shows that no coherent definition has actually yet been put forward by theologians. I've listed 4 of Martin's books at letter E, but if you're really adventurous, this is the first one you should try to read, as Dan Quayle annually tried to read Plato's Republic, with Maryland many years ago. If you want to know at the highest level of technical philosophy what's wrong with pro-theistic claims, Martin had read everything of significance that had been published up to the late 80s, and no matter how complex the arguments or abstruse the concepts, he follows the protheists into every arcane corner of thought and with obvious satisfaction annihilates them. His chapter 12, Divine Attributes and Incoherence, is essential reading for anyone who wants to be well-equipped to discuss these matters with believers who have gone beyond the initial stages of theology. I've already mentioned the way in which science has removed all sorts of phenomena from the area of divine causation, lightning and so on. But most people still haven't given up on the idea that God intervenes, apparently all the time, in human affairs. TV reporters and their bosses love it when survivors of disasters say God answered their prayers, the formula of speech. So it was a pleasant surprise that many of you are aware of. May 22nd of last year, when Wolf Blitzer on CNN rather rudely asked a young woman survivor if she thanked God for sparing her life. And after hemming and hawing, she said she was an atheist. I'll come back to the theme of God's alleged benevolent interventions in a few minutes. For now, I'd like to focus on a much larger topic, the universe. For those who insist that science and religion are compatible, 1964 was a good year. Rather like 1948 for fundamentalists who think the creation of the state of Israel was a sign of the approaching apocalypse. 1964 was when, accidentally, 2 physicists named Penzias and Wilson discovered the existence of cosmic microwave background radiation, earning them a Nobel Prize for providing conclusive evidence that the long hypothesized but controversial idea of a Big Bang origin of the universe was true, eliminating the competing steady-state theory. Theologians immediately pounced on this news, claiming it proved there really was a beginning of everything, which of course is exactly what the Bible was talking about in Genesis. And that necessarily implied a creator. We all know who that would be. Things got even better for the theologians as the cosmologists began to realize that if numerous very precise details of the emerging universe had been different, even on the tiniest scale, stars and galaxies and we ourselves would never have come into existence, a thesis called fine-tuning. That recognition is an essential part of the anthropic principle, the claim that the whole universe was tailor-made and designed for us, all the other millions of species, extant and extinct, being merely incidental. I'll come back to that idea in a minute. It may be worth noting that the phrase Big Bang might better have been Baby Bang or Micro Bang or Nano Bang, because the formative instant of the future universe took place on a size and time scale so small that, as I'd like to say, even God couldn't find it. The inflationary period, first hypothesized about 35 years ago, was over and done in less than a billionth of a second. That's understated, not overstated. And all the future matter of 10 to the 22nd stars and everything else was compressed, if that's the right word, inside a billionth of a centimeter. And that's also an understatement. In such context, talking about a creator God who controlled and arranged the Big Bang seems grotesquely inappropriate, intruding a fairy tale character into a scientific account. As in so many of these areas, the pro-theists simply assume what they need to demonstrate, that a non-material God thing that isn't even part of the space-time continuum can cause or control things in the physical world, whether it's the Big Bang or all those incredibly close tolerances that get labeled fine-tuning. And if you ask how, there's no answer except how it must have been. However, talking about very technical things like fine-tuning and the anthropic principle isn't within my area of competence. So I'll just refer you to two books at letter F by physicist Victor Stenger, who unfortunately died earlier this year, God, the Failed Hypothesis, and the Fallacy of Fine-Tuning, and one, letter G, by cosmologist Larry Krauss, A Universe from Nothing, all of which deal pretty effectively with that sort of problem. Incidentally, when you look at the spectacularly complicated formulas and equations that modern scientists use to describe all these processes, you have to wonder if the Hebrew divinity 13.8 billion years ago was doing its calculations with Greek alphabet letters and Arabic numerals. That would be very ecumenical of him, but it still seems, even if this seems like a frivolous criticism, does raise the issue of how the God thing thinks at all. Where is its brain? Where is its center of self-awareness? There's one more issue I want to raise regarding omnipotence, the ancient and rather dubious idea of divine inspiration. As long as the being was non-material, and so were we in our minds or souls, there wasn't a major problem in the traditional claim that God inspired the storytellers of the Bible. New Catholic Encyclopedia has a long article on inspiration. It was simply S to S, soul to soul communication. But with the advent of a neuroscience-based understanding of mental events, consciousness, free will, and so on, as ultimately material, physical in nature, it's a lot more difficult to see how the old notion would work. When people say rather blithely that the Bible is God's word, it's fair to ask how a non-physical being can cause even one word to appear in a network of cells in a person's brain. How does it make the right neurons fire? That is, how does it cause gazillions of atoms and molecules to move on a space-time scale that matches that billions I just mentioned? And once again, the answer would be it just does. It's magic. For C, omniscience. Claims of omniscience are just as problematic as those for omnipotence. Martin's section on the topic is at pages 287 to 297. Martin notes that there are three basic types of knowledge that the God thing might have. Propositional knowledge, procedural knowledge, and knowledge by acquaintance. And right away the troubles begin, because procedural knowledge is knowing how to do things. If we consider, for example, knowing how to exercise on parallel bars, an example Martin actually uses, there is an inescapable contradiction between having that knowledge, which requires a physical body, all sorts of neuromuscular skills, and being disembodied, which the God thing is by definition. The pro-theistic arguments on the other two types of knowledge are way too complicated for a presentation at this level, but Martin shows very effectively that even the most convoluted definitions and explanations of omniscience run straight into incoherence and fail miserably. Because Martin is concerned with the highly professionalized arguments as they played out in books and academic journals, he doesn't consider, or need to consider, some common sense issues. But for a comparatively amateurish presentation like this, most of my presentations are amateur, I'm not getting paid, that is to say, I think they deserve a few seconds. Conventional definitions of omniscience, of course, insist that the God thing knows everything about everything. And that obviously includes us, the human species, since we're the only thing on Earth it's really interested in. But these days, there are 7 billion people living at any moment, and knowing what we're doing, what we're saying, and what we're thinking implies having constant awareness of 21 billion simultaneous incoming information streams that are constantly changing. Now you can reduce that to 14 billion if God thinks monitoring takes a break while a third of us are asleep, getting our 8 hours of every night. But those states are changing on an individual basis every microsecond. And it presumably has to keep track of every birth and death, which itself is quite a task, because the World Health Organization says that every year there are about, and he guesses how many deaths worldwide per year. Steve, stay on this. Any guesses? Order of magnitude figure is 55 million deaths of born alive human beings. Do some division, you'll come down to 1.6 deaths per second, 24/7. And, ominously, 130 million births to keep track of as well, 4%. This suggests that the fabled Judgment Day will be more like Judgment half second, and will get shorter as the death rate of our growing population increases. Even if the theologians say with their usual self-assurance that the God thing can easily do all of that, there's a different question. Why? At least at the popularized level of religion, we get the impression that the God thing is a souped-up version of the NSA, or maybe not souped-up version, putting all of us under the closest imaginable surveillance. But paying that much attention to 7 billion human animals and all the rich variety of our doings and thinkings, edifying and otherwise, seems unworthy of the God thing's time. And pretty surely, constant awareness of everything would get to be colossal. Boring thing. There's even the further question of whether observing our activities would cause emotional reactions like joy or anger. Theologians have talked for centuries about the impassibility of God, with an I in the middle, not an A, meaning that God, being eternally unchanging, cannot have passions or strong feelings which would come and go, implying change. Yet the unintellectualized preachers and ordinary folk don't hesitate to say God rejoices in this or is wrathful about that. I don't know how they reconcile that idea with the old scholastic medieval insistence that God must be simplex et unus, simple and unitary, because if it had parts, it could be broken up and dissolved. By the way, if you want to look that up, Aquinas discusses and reaffirms the simplicity of God in the Summa, part 1, question 3, and the unity of God, part 1, question 11. These things have been dealt with by profession. There's another problem that comes with the claim of omniscience, the ancient chestnut of divine foreknowledge and free will that thinkers have wrestled with for centuries. Once again, Martin has a trenchant subchapter, pages 297 to 302, arguing that the God thing cannot be both omniscient and absolutely free, because total freedom would mean not knowing the consequences of its own future acts. And even worse, if we humans are also free in a meaningful way, the God thing could not know what we will do in the future. It therefore cannot intervene responsibly in our affairs, because it could not know what will happen if it does. That, too, goes against most people's instincts, since they want to maintain both at once, that we are free and responsible for what we do, and that God knows everything in advance. I've mentioned neuroscience several times already, and here too, this rapidly developing area of research has brought forward evidence and ideas that are a major challenge to the old forms of thought. All sorts of innovative experiments and just plain introspection have combined to produce an alternative view of free will, summarized a dozen years ago in Daniel Reitner's book, The Illusion of Conscious Will, letter H. Our decisions simply appear in consciousness. We have no awareness of where they came from or how they're made, which of course has all sorts of uncomfortable implications for the criminal justice system and also for religious claims about sin and responsibility. Continuing this amateur level of discussion, I'd like to consider briefly the idea of the divine being's mind. The innocent view is that the God thing observes everything all at once, everywhere. This, of course, is not an experience for which our minds can provide any kind of analog. We've all heard of several dozen people with super memory who say it's like having a split screen in their heads where one side can just bring up any past event instantaneously. But for the God thing, there would be billions of screens, all being viewed in some sense simultaneously. And as already suggested, most of what it would be seeing is not very inspirational, especially when it's the hideous things that humans do to each other, and it's not going to intervene in any way except maybe offering hope and courage to keep on enduring those horrors and miseries. I haven't had a chance to ask trained theologians what they think God's moment-to-moment state of consciousness is like, but it's one place where human-based analogies won't get us very far. For F, benevolence or omnibenevolence. Topics of divine benevolence, the goodness of God, the problem of evil are among the most difficult issues to handle, both for professional theologians and the rest of us too. I've seen quotes, so I can't provide the reference, from a number of philosophers who say that the problem of evil convinces them that God as conventionally defined cannot exist. However, just when you think an issue has just one side to it, a contrarian view comes along as a salutary reminder that most issues do have at least two. Timothy Keller's recent book, The Reason for God, letter I, actually has a brief subchapter, 25 to 28, arguing that all the appalling evil and suffering in the world may be an argument not against, but for God's existence. Keller is a minister in New York City who has created a large following by unapologetically proclaiming the infallibility of the Bible, the triune or trinitarian nature of God, and the literal bodily resurrection of Jesus. In other words, by finding a sizable percentage of supposedly street-smart New Yorkers who we would say are, in fact, not so street-smart. Keller's argument itself, as you might guess, is a little strange. He starts by citing C.S. Lewis. He's not off to a good start, because for all his rhetorical eloquence and popular success, Lewis was not, as even his admirers will concede, a qualified theologian. But the value of an argument is independent of the person promoting it, so let's focus on that. The central point of Lewis's famous argument is that we may feel like condemning the divine being for all the misery in the world, but where do we get that deep and instinctive sense of moral outrage at injustice? The implied answer, supported by Lewis through a quotation from Alvin Plantinga, one of the foremost defenders of theism in the 20th century, is that our fundamental ethical sense, which Lewis called the moral law, must have been implanted from somewhere. Where else but God? The alternative that we just evolved a moral sense, both Lewis and Plantinga regard as absurd. But that, of course, is exactly what many studies of animal behavior do suggest. For example, the primate studied by Franz de Waal at Emory. Namely, that there is evidence of something like moral sensibilities in non-human creatures, which might mean that the God thing was more generous in dispensing those capacities than we used to think. Or it might mean that morality does indeed have an evolutionary origin and needs no divinity as its source. As a kind of clincher, Keller, the minister in New York, notes that the God thing itself, or one-third of itself, in the form of Jesus, took on human shape and suffered too. Not just physical pain, the crucifixion, but far more significant in Keller's view, the mental agony of being utterly abandoned by his loving father. Now, I would have thought that the most agonizing kind of rejection would come from one's mother. Freud had a lot to say about boys and their mamas, maybe father. But we all know that the Judeo-Christian tradition does have a problem with females. Anyway, Keller doesn't explain how Jesus, having lived on his own theory as part of the Trinity for all eternity up to 1 AD, could on the one hand know that the God thing was his true father and feel devastated by abandonment, on the other could forget or not know what the divine plan behind all this was. What did they talk about during all those billions of years together, waiting patiently, patience is a divine virtue, for humanity to arise and then fall and then need to be saved? It would appear that 1/3 of the Trinity was not omniscient, at least in this regard. Theologians constantly waffle in this way when they try to deal with the divine and human aspects of Jesus, both in his allegedly eternal nature and his very temporary human existence. But when you're dealing with inherent self-contradiction, it's hard to be consistent. There are other problems that come with asserting omnibenevolence or goodness as a divine attribute, even though the perfect goodness of the God thing has been a central claim of theology for centuries. In the 2 weeks since doing the first version of this talk, I've been reading a book by two very conservative theologian philosophers, this is letter J, which, as you can see by its title, should be trying to prove to us that God is indeed perfectly good. Good God, the theistic foundation of morality. Instead, David Baggett of Jerry Falwell's Liberty University and Jerry Walls, formerly at Asbury Theological Seminary and now at Notre Dame, which is very ecumenical of them, do what used to be called begging the question, assuming the answer in the way they formulate the question. They already know in their book right from the start that God exists. They already know that God is perfect, which entails moral perfection. And they know that the Bible contains genuine commands, that's their phrase, from God. And most interestingly, they are sure that God cannot, because of his essential nature, issue commands that we humans would regard as indisputably evil. For them, it's impossible to imagine God, to borrow a phrase, breaking bad. So I'm still looking for a good argument that God must be morally perfect. People speak casually about the good Lord, and no one challenges them to explain the adjective. But good is very loosely applied to the divinity of the Bible. In the 1,400-page volume, Erdman's Dictionary of the Bible, letter K, there's an article on violence by Cheryl Kirk-Dugan, a PhD from Baylor, who spent some time on the faculty of the Graduate Theological Union at Berkeley, a consortium of religious schools, not California Berkeley. She states in her article that in the Old Testament alone, there are about 600 acts of human-on-human violence, and remarkably, about 1,000 acts of divine violence. She's now at Shaw University in North Carolina, and I wrote on Friday to ask for a copy of this list, assuming she has one. I got a response this morning by email saying she doesn't have a list, and she referred me to an article which is at the Stitt Library up north of UT campus, so I can get it this afternoon if I'm lucky. It won't be a list either. I'm still waiting to get a list of 1,000 acts of divine violence. Her definition of violent may be a little casual. She regards the removal of Adam's rib to make Eve as a violent act. This might depend on whether some form of anesthesia, local or general, was applied. But if her round number is anywhere near accurate and valid, the God thing has a lot to answer for. Even if the apologists could come up with reasons or excuses for every one of the 1,000, the overall picture is really unsavory. If that's what God is like, I, for one, am not impressed. We can criticize the storytellers who came up with such tales, either for being so attracted to violence as an element in a supposedly religious narrative, or for their lack of imagination in being unable to create a divinity more worthy of respect. Now, it might be possible to brush aside some, or even a lot of that violence by saying that the victims were bad people who had it coming. But that just draws our attention to the most problematic area of divine benevolence, the issue of undeserved suffering. When people speak of the problem of evil, they mean the miseries and horrors of life that only a hardcore Calvinist would say we deserve because of original sin. Try looking up the acronym TULIP in Wikipedia, the Calvinist doctrine that we are all born in total depravity. That's the T of the tulip system of Calvinism. That's pretty demented. Some religious thinkers do acknowledge the seriousness of this problem. It's been almost 35 years since Rabbi Harold Kushner had a bestseller, letter L, titled When Bad Things Happen to Good People. And more recently, also at letter L, Focus on the Family's James Dobson has a book charmingly titled When God Doesn't Make Sense, which indeed would be a lot of the time. Their arguments are sufficiently weak, I'm not going to deal with them now, except to note that if they were genuinely persuasive, we'd all be converts. Of course, benevolence, from Latin benevolentia, simply means wishing well. But instead of merely saying that God wishes us well, Christians make an even stronger claim about divine affection for our species, and sometimes it can be turned against us. A relentlessly sardonic, now long gone, friend of mine once said he'd asked an equally sardonic friend, what's the most ridiculous thing they say in Christianity? The answer, with an unctuous worthy of Ted Haggard in his prime, was, God loves you. And a strange and wondrous love it must be, considering all the appalling things that happen, as Rabbi Kushner observed, to people who profess to love that God thing with all their heart. One of my previous CFI talks used a bumper sticker line, which as far as I know hasn't been commercialized yet, that would say, or in another place in coffee cups and plaques and so on, smile, God loves you, asterisk, smaller print, but not enough. That would solve the problem of evil in a rather brusque fashion. But that quasi-humorous point leads to a more substantial formulation. It seems to me that preachers and theologians should stop saying, as they frequently do, God is love. And speaking grammatically, should reverse the subject and predicate, do this to it. That revealed what they really mean. Love is God in their minds. From my perspective as a classicist, I think they would do better to become Heracliteans. Heraclitus was famous for insisting on the harmony of opposites, meaning that the God thing would be described as both love and hate, peace and war, good and evil, 50-50, 51-49, whatever. Breaking Bad occasionally. That would, by the way, reinforce the age-old witticism that we humans did create God in our own image, since the God thing would then possess the rich mixture of contradictory qualities we can easily find sitting there right in the mirror. There is one more limitation on divine benevolence and perfect goodness that I want to mention before getting, at last, to the final section of this talk. Again, it's not something new, but it's still something that hasn't been rationalized away. For centuries, Christians have been, at least on the surface, comfortable with two very different ideas, that God is love, and also that God sends billions of us humans to an eternal hell for not having enough faith, or doing enough good works, or not receiving inexplicable divine grace, or some combination thereof. I've already cited Timothy Keller as a defender of conventional views, but even more refreshing for its unabashed acceptance of the most unappetizing ideas is this book, Robert Jeffress, and you can read the title all the way to the back, Hell, question mark, yes, exclamation point, and the subtitle, this is at letter M, and other outrageous truths you can still believe. A member of the CFI community put that Stuckey was actually raised in his congregation up in North Texas, which must have been an interesting experience. Chapter 3 of that book is God sends good people to hell. Though the word good should be in quotation marks, since disappointingly he doesn't mean it quite the way it sounds. It would be really interesting, for example, if he argued seriously that God sent Hitler and his minions to heaven and Dietrich Bonhoeffer to hell. Bonhoeffer was a much admired Lutheran theologian executed for alleged involvement in plots against Hitler. Jeffress also insists this is his chapter 2 title, God is ultimately responsible for suffering, which he acknowledges is often beyond comprehension. He doesn't conclude that God is Heraclitean because he asserts that every evil of the present and past will ultimately be made good and redeemed in the future, apparently a very distant future. But that reference to future invites a question about the past, and I apologize to those who've heard this from me endlessly in various contexts. We humans are, perhaps inevitably, anthropocentric. We firmly believe we are superior to all other genuses and species on the planet, and our religious texts like Genesis explicitly put us in charge of all life. But as already noted, there are millions of species of life, at least 1.7, maybe 10, who knows. And a continuous, unbroken line of evolution links us all. So if the God thing does indeed love us now, who was the first human it loved whose parents it didn't care about at all? This is yet another version of my favorite argument form, fancily called the Sorites paradox, or more simply the continuum or threshold problem. How can there be a physiological genetic dividing line? And more importantly, how can it be morally justified to draw an all or nothing line between any set of parents and their children? The alleged special status of humankind and our alleged possession of souls would have to start somewhere between here and 6 to 7 million years ago when we split off from our fellow primates. And it should take only a little thought to see that that can't be a valid claim. Finally, 4G, existence. Before I get to the last subtopic of this chapter, I should mention the letters N and O list some prominent pro- and anti-God books. At N, all but Swinburne's are part of the reaction against the new atheists. At O, the first two are classics of the 60s, and the last one, by a Dutch philosopher of religion, is a refutation of attempts by Swinburne and others to use Bayesian probability arguments to prove statements about God. Nick Everett's book is an excellent introduction to Michael Martin's more complex book, already noted at letter E, and I've enthusiastically recommended Richard Robinson's Atheist Values before, and will just say that part 2 out of the 3 parts is really splendid. The book is a series of what must have been very bracing lectures to undergraduates at Oxford in the 50s and 60s, maybe 40s. Anthony Kenny's book is less well known in secular and atheist circles, but he quietly demonstrates the failure of the 5 ways Thomas Aquinas used to try to prove the existence of the God thing. And that's my final subject for today, the existence of the God thing. You might have expected this to be the first subject, but I've held it back so that everything else you've already heard would be anticlimactic. If I started by claiming to disprove the existence of the God thing, there wouldn't be much point in talking about its attributes. I'm also going to merge existence with another topic that could be dealt with separately, omnipresence. After all, if the God thing exists, in whatever sense of the word, it must exist somewhere. My critique will focus on 2 questions. First question, if you ask most people, even including theologians, where is God? The answer would have been, until pretty recently, everywhere. And there wouldn't be much hesitation. I mentioned to you at the beginning of this book that for thousands of years the universe was centered on this planet, and there was nothing else even remotely as large. The sun and the moon were little tiny objects in the sky, and the stars were points of light. But the famous decentering of our astronomical vision from Copernicus to the Big Bang has produced an astoundingly different picture, with a universe that is 10 to the 21st miles in every observable direction and accelerating its expansion, meaning that the Earth, with a radius of 4 times 10 to the 3rd miles, is 18 orders of magnitude smaller than the universe, smaller than a subatomic particle is to us. So theologians, seeking to be with it and up to date in their campaign to co-opt science, have responded by saying that the God thing is not part of the space-time continuum. You can find this in serious theological texts. I'm not sure where it is supposed to be. I do hope it's at least a 3-dimensional place, because I wouldn't want to think of Almighty God being flat. Flatland, 19th century. That might be an appropriate metaphor, because there's question number 2, and it also used to have a simple answer, even if it's a little bit mischievous. When is God? This time the traditional response would be that God is eternal and timeless, usually meaning that God existed before the universe was created, exists now, and will exist for all future time. But the modern strategy of taking God out of the space-time continuum has an awkward consequence. It's deceptively easy to say that the God thing caused and fine-tuned the Big Bang. But star formation and galaxy formation went on for about 10 billion years before our sun and the solar system came along. And some 100 billion galaxies are now scattered at inconceivable distances in all directions. So if that divine being wants to intervene in our world at any point, just in the last few thousand years, to cause Hollywood-style miracles, as in the forthcoming movie Exodus, or to impregnate a nice Jewish girl, there are two rather tricky questions. How does it find here, and how does it find now? I just said there are 100 billion galaxies out there. Larry Krauss's book, A Universe from Nothing, says there may be 400 billion. And if you've seen one, you've seen them all, in general terms. That, of course, is what divine omniscience is for. Knowledge of the three-dimensional coordinates of deep space would be, as Sherlock Holmes liked to say, elementary. But the time question remains. If the divine being exists outside the past, present, future timeline that's linear, in some kind of holographic planar zone, like this, all time compressed into 2 dimensions, then finding any particular instant might be something of a challenge. I have to admit, I don't have the brain power to imagine what it would be like to come from a non-temporal place and have to locate with very great precision a specific point in a time-bound universe. But I don't think we should assume it would be easy, even for a divine being. Now, it may have occurred to you that this talk has been dealing, as the item on the handout page says, with two quite different conceptions of the God thing. There's God 1.0, the biblical character, and by extension virtually all the mythological gods of pre-modern peoples, anthropomorphic, anthropocentric, and as I like to say, shrink-wrapped around our planet. And then there's God 2.0, the up-to-date cosmological entity that could set off the Big Bang and fine-tune the universe. Google does bring up uses of God 1.0 and God 2.0, so those phrases aren't my invention. But I went several pages deep into hits without finding them applied in this kind of context. At this point, I can't resist repeating 2 more bumper sticker lines from my second wave of secular humanism talk, a truncated version of which is actually going to be published in Free Inquiry next fall. The first line draws on modern astronomy, applies to the shrink-wrapped God 1.0. The universe is too big for God. The second, agreeably paradoxical line draws on modern physics with reference to atomic or subatomic causality, God 2.0. The universe has no room for God, in spite of being too big. To move toward the end, at last. Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel has famously said that God died in Auschwitz around 1944. That would be God 1.0. But I say God died in 1929 when Edwin Hubble produced data showing conclusively, after decades of dispute, that there's more than one galaxy. In fact, a lot more, 100 billion or whatever. Parenthetically, I can't resist mentioning, 3.5 years ago, our CFI, nonfiction book group, read Richard Holmes's fascinating book, The Age of Wonder, which shows, at page 123, that William Herschel, astronomer in England, was speculating about what he called island universes in the 1780s. Talk about being ahead of your time. But there's a problem with God 2.0, the one that tries to reestablish religion as superior to science. Some of you are old enough to remember when Microsoft Windows came out in 1985. Some weren't born. It was promoted as a whole new thing, a giant leap forward. But if you looked under the hood, what did you find? Add, move, jump, all the old 3-letter command line syntax items. It was good old DOS, sitting underneath Windows. I think the same can be said about God 2.0. They may claim it's new and improved, but if you look more closely, it's still God 1.0 just below the surface. That is, whenever they stop talking about the cosmological aspect, they immediately revert to that shrink-wrapped entity that hovers around the Earth, paying attention to us and nothing else, and making all the usual demands and threats. So at the risk of seeming to dismiss something that millions have taken with deadly seriousness over the centuries, I think it's time, in fact it's overdue since 1929, to say that the concept called God, that is 1.0, has been falsified by reality and should be abandoned. It has no evidentiary support, it has no explanatory power, either in scientific or moral terms, and the arguments for it have failed critical examination. But in practice, because all discussion of 2.0 collapses back into 1.0, even the updated version can be safely dismissed as well. A further consequence of this rather brash argument is that agnosticism is no longer needed as a safe and prudent response to the assertions of the protheists. Richard Dawkins said years ago that Darwin had made it intellectually respectable to be an atheist. Now we should expand on that, saying it is not intellectually necessary to be an agnostic. You recall that in God Delusion, Dawkins sets up a scale of 1 to 7 for degree of belief in God, with 1 being absolutely certain there is, and 7 absolutely certain there isn't. Dawkins himself, rather disappointingly, opts for 6, leaving himself a cushion of safety just in case. This is not really good for him. I think it's time for the secular world to declare that kind of evasion a mistake. The concept called God, whether 1.0 or 2.0 or any of the other 999,999, simply doesn't fit with reality anymore. And I'd like to see people on the secular side move away from a reliance on reason and rationality, since it's well established that humans don't adopt or defend their deeply held ideas by reason, and focus instead on reality, as discovered and verified by science. I'll close by quoting something totally obscure from 40 years ago. I still haven't found my original of this, I'm sorry to say. In 1974, when I was on the faculty of UIC in Chicago, there was a creationist campaign going on in Illinois. And a fellow I've tried to contact a month ago on a Facebook message with no response wrote a letter to the editor in the Chicago Tribune. His name is Troy Soos, S-O-O-S, and his Wikipedia page says he's a high school physics teacher and living in Florida and a novelist. He ended his letter with a splendid phrase, which is a 0 to this day in Google, saying that if all the world's creation myths were studied together, and not just the Bible and science, they would instantly be recognized as, quoting the phrase, the fanciful fabrications of ignorant peoples. I can't top that. Thank you very much for watching. Now, are there questions? Yes.
This would probably be a whole other talk, but what do you think are the best psychological reasons that belief in God continues to hold such power over people that we evolve to see agents in the world, that this is kind of a byproduct of how we perceive, or what's the best explanation you think?
Agency attribution is one of the standard lines, and Pascal has a book on this subject explaining religion. There's a lot of different psychological and social explanations. People are usually 90 whatever percent of the time believers in the religion that they were raised in. You get apostates, you get converts, and people moving in and out, but most people stay where they were raised. And if you're raised in a powerful monolithic religion, escape avenues are going to be very few. The problem with attribution of causality is exactly where science has made its inroads, of course, because you take away the divine beings throwing lightning bolts. Even in the ancient world, by the way, it was said that Zeus was not very accurate because he sometimes hit his own temples with lightning. But you could make a theological explanation of that, of course. So there's all sorts of factors that go into it. I used to hear it said, probably still said in Catholic Church, that if they get you for the first 10 years of your life, you'll never be anything better than a lapsed Catholic. You'll never be able to walk away and pick out their hooks in you. But that just shows that it's a socially conditioned system. If you took twins, there must be studies in Larry Wright's book and so on twins raised apart, raised in different religions, genetically all but identical, raised them in this religion, they grew up with that, and raised them in this religion, they grew up with that. So it's clearly not something ingrained. Maybe both of them will attribute to divine powers the things that occur, but you can unlearn that. That's why the great line of Richard Feynman in Science is a way of trying not to fool yourself. People have been fooling themselves for centuries. Yeah, that's your shirt. Yeah, there it is. sales afterwards.
Not your shirts.
Oh, I have a suggestion for you. There's another attribute that you might add to your list that, of course, is also problematic, and that's perfection.
Yeah, I've thought about that because, as you've heard me say, it's perfect and morally perfect. At one point in Baggett and Walls' book. This is a very interesting question. I was going to say, and I didn't write it into this, you frequently hear in popular explanations of problems, the world ought, ain't, is. Right? Things ought to be this way, but you look at the real world, no matter what you look at it, it ain't that way. And I'm going to reverse the polarity on that and say, with regard to perfection and its spillover to moral perfection, is, ain't, ought. In the secular world, Sam Harris produced a book called The Moral Landscape a couple of years ago. He tried to say we can go from natural facts to moral obligations. This is something that philosophers and theologians say you can't get to. And yet the theologians themselves do get to it when they say God is perfect. And perfection necessarily encompasses moral perfection. This is a really puzzling argument. I didn't throw it into this paper, but some of you know there's an Anselmian argument that God is the being a greater than which cannot exist, or cannot be imagined. Quo maius cogitari non potest is the Latin, where maius implies the magnitudo, magnitude. The greatness of God is infinite. And that would seem to me to imply, I haven't tried this on the theologian either, I may be doing this paper in the spring at St. Edward's. And the instructor there, who was here a couple of years ago, Innes Mitchell, said he might try to get an auditorium and bring in people from outside his own communications class. But I would be fascinated to hear theologians respond to some of this, because I would like to say that Anselmian argument, Baggett and Walls say they are Anselmians. Very important about this. Anselm's arguments are so good. Is that the greatness of God requires God to be perfect. And I would say a God is greater if it can do two things, or one. If it can be only perfectly good, that's just one thing. But if it can be perfectly bad, that's two things. So that's a greater God. How do you argue against me without begging the question and imputing and assuming that God must be perfect? And perfect means perfectly good. I'd like a God who's perfectly bad as well. Just on weekends and days off and whatever. Being a bad divinity. Folklore has frequently brothers or trickster gods where you have the good God who arranged the world and then the evil God or the stupid brother who went around and messed everything up. I think you might as well telescope those into our one divinity if we want to have room for one and make God alternatively good and bad. That explains the world, of course, if you like.
Isn't that kind of Buddhist idea?
But without the divinities. I mean, Buddhists don't have any divinities, but they certainly have plenty of evil. And it's fascinating if you've looked at, for example, this hugely selling book, Proof of Heaven, by Harvard neurosurgeon Dr. Eben Alexander. It sold zillions of copies. There's an article about a year and something ago in Esquire magazine by Luke Dittrich that really takes his life and career and character apart. It's very alarming to read. He hasn't sued them apparently, so it must be true. Printed it. But Eben Alexander is an innocent theologian, says out in the universe, the 10 to the 21st miles and multiverses and whatever, there's just goodness all over the place, exploding stars and black holes and so on. And the amount of evil that we see on our planet, that humans suffer and maybe animals suffer, is tiny in comparison with this vast goodness of God that is out there. This is what happens when you put the blinders on and say, I see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil. It's really embarrassing paragraphs. You should have taken it to a theologian and asked, does this make any sense? It's hardcore theologians other than Calvinists. Read up on Calvinists. People that are deeply demented when they talk about us being born in total depravity. I love it. But it pushes you right off the chart. But this is, you're right, perfection is an interesting characteristic to attribute to a being. And then to import moral qualities into it, which aren't there. Is, ain't, ought. I looked up is, ain't, ought, and people have used that on Google as well, but again, not in the way I was going to use it, in this theological fashion. So, again, about 50% of my phrases are unique and vetted by me. So it's not about that average. Arnie?
And just a personal remembrance on the question of why the other side has such a firm grip on nearly everyone. When I was a kid, I pretended to believe things that I didn't believe because That's what the grown-ups expected of me. I mean, there's a tremendous amount of pressure on adolescents and young adults.
Yeah,
Before, period. I mean, it's hard to resist.
Right. And if you look at any culture, look at culture south of the border, for example. Like just there's an LA Times op-ed right now, just in the last couple of days, saying the Virgin of Guadalupe is a great unifier for the Mexican culture here on this side of the border and south, and they have all these social conflicts and so on. But they can all rally around the Virgin out there, the familiar icon, loves everybody, and is really nice. Jesus is not as nice as his mom. See, there's obviously some tension there when he's raised as a illegitimate child or whatever. So the social context of these things is almost as powerful as the attribution of agency and causality and so on. And this is something that is very hard to break through. The size of our group and the size of megachurches is just alarming. And we've run into people in this group and stood up here and been out in the audiences and elsewhere who have said, I was raised, and then they still in the denomination, one of the 33,090 or whatever, and I did walk away from it. About 4 or 5 years ago, there's a fellow named Doyle Dew from Alabama who's here. Chuck Saleh let me borrow a copy of his book. I still have it. He was raised as a Baptist preacher and thought himself out of it in a context in small town Alabama where if you declare you don't believe in God, you don't have a lot of friends in town anymore. And people, whether it's Mormons or whether it's other forms of hardcore belief, you get ostracized with a vengeance. We can talk to the people from Scientology, what they do to you if you walk away and say bad things. It's even worse. But this is part of the social, familial, neighbor kinds of pressures that are applied to people. It's really hard. And that's why in making arguments like this, some of this is flippant and frivolous and childish and so on and so forth, but you try to present things like the appeal to reality rather than to reason, because people do have a conscience, and almost invariably it's their conscience that will make them think about this, and eventually it wears away and they say, I just can't do it anymore. I've been reading conversion stories in both directions. There's a book by Robert Bob Altenmeyer called Amazing Conversions, Prometheus Press, published a couple of years ago. And he looked and he interviewed people who went in both directions, from hardcore belief to unbelief, and from hardcore unbelief to belief. And he found different characteristics involved in the different paths. The people who went from unbelief to religion, like Peter Hitchens, that's on your list, the brother of Christopher Hitchens, say they want answers. They want things solved. They want the world to make sense. They want to stop the questioning. Whereas the people who went from belief to unbelief frequently would say, my parents instilled in me, find answers that are the best answers and seek for truth through rational questioning rather than adoption of revelation or whatever. So there are very different mindsets, even though the process looked like mirror image. There were different kinds of attitudes. Now, where people get those attitudes that they start with is an interesting question. But it means within the believer community, there's a certain small core of people who are susceptible to the arguments we present. But also, there may be some of you out in the audience who may become Catholic someday. I don't know. Maybe better evidence is presented. Because people can be drawn across the line in either direction. On the other hand, if you went back 250 years, the number of people professing what's being professed in this room might be the entire total in Europe. Maybe 350 years ago. The number of unbelievers had been growing faster than anything except maybe evangelicals in South America or something. So there is a growth curve here. It's rather encouraging. But it's an uphill battle. They've got they say that the Campus Crusade for Christ has a $400 million national budget. What does ACA and CFI have as national, even at the national level, what's our budget? Or what does Openly Secular have as its budget? Composite of 30 different secular groups. It's not $400 million. So they've got a lot of resources that we don't have. But on the other hand, they don't have valid arguments. So that's their weakness. I think that's probably
Thank you. That's the answer.
Okay. Well, just one question. Ask you why. To elaborate on why want atheists to be more of that 7 absolute certainty instead of that 6. I go between both myself.
Yeah.
And there are certain claims that you can show. Yeah, it's impossible to claim for all something that could possibly exist that we don't have proof for. So why?
Yeah, the theists will always say, well, we don't understand things, but then that's the God 2.0. There are limits to human imagination and mind to what God is. And Baghdad Walls in that book say God is so far beyond us as the heavens are above the earth, and where the heavens are. Their astronomy needs to be a little weak. But this is just a desperate ploy to try to do what in Greek is called saving the phenomena, to preserve things. If you're having waffling between 6 and 7, I would strongly recommend getting Nick Everett's book, which is the introductory book, or Michael Martin's book, The My Way, and read your way through it. It's one of the hardest things intellectually I ever tried to read, is Michael Martin's collection of atheistic arguments from all over the literature. It's like reading Immanuel Kant and some of the German philosophers. But when you see the attributes taken apart with rigorous logic, I contacted Martin by email about 10 years ago because the relentless dotting of every I, crossing of every T, and gloating about it when he finishes a section. These are the best arguments ever put forward in this category, and since we've demolished them, we can be pretty sure there probably won't be any better arguments along this line in the future. So I emailed him, I said, were you trained by the Jesuits? He wrote an exclamation was, I've never had anything to do with the Catholic Church in all my life. So eye-poppingly, like flamed by Michael Martin. But there is no more rigorous treatment that I have run across in atheist literature. He makes the Dawkinses and the Hitchens look like amateurs, theologically, professionally, philosophically. Really good. Yes, fine.
I think the waffling between 6 and 7 is an illusion that I think those of us that put us in the 6 category do not see any conceivable way that there could be such a thing. But there's a formalism of not accepting absolutes.
Right.
That in science you don't prove anything, although there's some things that we're so darn sure of. It's impossible to imagine it could be another way. So a 6, it's impossible for us to imagine. Right. That's an easy thing to say. It's impossible for me to imagine something that I can't imagine.
Right.
So it's just a formalism for some of us that we're not waiting for a proof of a God. We don't expect anything like that. It's just that we're unwilling to say we're absolutely positive and nothing would change our minds.
Yeah, it's the anthropocentricity and the geocentricity that I think are really powerful arguments. Once you realize the scale of the universe, unless you want to adopt the anthropic principle and say 100 billion galaxies all came into existence so that after 13.8 billion years, shrink-wrapped divinity could start sending 90% of us to hell. 200,000 years, it's hard to believe. And the failure rate isn't at least 90%. When you think about, not Lucy, but just early Homo sapiens. Once you get over your anthropocentricity and geocentricity, I think it's a lot easier because you have to look at things from a larger perspective. You can't have a first soul or a first human as the object of divine solicitude on this long, absolutely perfect, finely graded continuum that goes back 200,000 years or 6 million years or whatever. If Lucy didn't have a soul, who did? That's 3.2 million years ago. Who was the first? How will you justify that? Once you see that there's no answer to this, is where I can quote conscience, because it's an easy argument. It was originally the Sorites paradox. You start with a pile of sand, take one grain away, and keep on doing it. When does it stop being a pile? 3, 2, 1, 0. It never stopped being a pile. It's an argument from the lifetime of Aristotle. And there's I just asked a very well-paid philosophy professor 3 days ago, and right outside his office, the 4th floor of Wagner Hall, Mark Sainsbury, who's written a text on paradoxes. And he rated the other great paradox of Euclides, the liar paradox, which is, I am lying. If it's true, it's false. If it's false, it's true. He rated that in his textbook as a 10 on a 10 scale of difficulty. But he didn't in his textbook rate the Sorites, the heat paradox. So I asked him, point blank, I said, for the record, how difficult is the Sorites? He doesn't think it's an insoluble one, but he told me it's probably a 9 out of 10. And there are whole books and articles under the rubric of vagueness. It's not called Sorites paradox much in the literature now, But if you look up Philosopher's Index, which is their online bibliography, you'll find over 400 typable keyword hits on vagueness. Well known, it's an extremely difficult problem in modern philosophy. So if you see a problem that's verbally insoluble, conscience eventually goes to work and dissolves all these beliefs. I hope, I think, I'd like to say. I'll find out someday. It's not that far off either. Anyway, thank you all for coming.